Good afternoon, guys. I decided to do a video for this week's forum, so I'm going to discuss the Rock Creek Park Deer Management Plan and the National Park Service Environmental Impact Statement, record of decision regarding that plan, and a legal challenge to it. So to jump in, just a little bit of background. The Rock Park Deer Management Plan pertains to National Park Service's management of deer populations in the Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. So this is the National Park Service had identified that the park had been overpopulated by deer. There's no obviously national predators for deer in Washington, D.C., and that they were eating the natural vegetation and kind of just disrupting the park. And they felt that they needed a management plan to deal with that. So they developed the environmental impacts statement, did appropriate NEPA analysis. Plan kind of started development in the mid to late 2000s. The comment period occurred for 2 months in 2009. The plan was finalized in 2012, and then the lawsuit was filed, and I'll be talking about the specific lawsuit in a minute. The lawsuit was filed in late 2012, early 2013, being adjudicated in early 2013. So the environmental impact statement basically allowed a series of alternatives, and what the DC Parks went with was a combination of lethal force to harvest overpopulated deer. I think they were trying to, over several years, lower them by half each year. So in 2014, for example, 2015, for example, they harvested 26 deer, reducing the total herd from around 50 to around 25, 26. A combination of that and the and euthanasia, so tranquilizing and euthanasia. So the lawsuit was filed by 5 different individuals and then an environmental group within the DC area, and it challenged various aspects of the plan with the general concept of trying to disrupt the plan from being placed into motion. What I mean by that is that they identified some issues, one of which I'll talk about in a second, that aren't necessarily related to their main complaint. Their main complaint was that they didn't like the concept of shooting and killing deer in the middle of Washington, D.C., but they challenged the plan on a variety of different procedural issues, hoping that one would stick and they would be able to use that to disrupt. Obviously, it's a legitimate legal strategy. If you have a problem with the action or law, you don't have to just litigate on the issues you have a problem with. If there's any weak parts in the law, you can use that to kind of pick it apart. So that's what they tried to do, and were unsuccessful. So generally the lawsuit was dismissed in favor of National Park Service, but I'm going to talk about one specific challenge that they attempted. The specific challenge is that the National Park System failed to consider the exotic non-native plants during their environmental impact statement and failed in their management plan. So the 5 citizens in the environmental group said that they were required to consider these exotic plants. The National Park Service failed to. The National Park Service put up 2 defenses to that legal complaint. The first was that it was an inappropriate challenge because it came out of left field. No citizens left any comments or made any comments during public meetings or any other lead up to this about invasive species, and this action, bringing it up in a lawsuit, they didn't really have standing to do that because they hadn't brought that up in the past. This defense was dismissed by the judge. Judge said that the National Park Service brought up exotic species or exotic plants in their EIS no less than 30 times themselves. They spoke about the effects of exotic non-native plants. They obviously given it some analysis, but hadn't given it the full analysis or weight that an EIS over non-native exotic plants might deserve, and certainly hadn't incorporated it in their management plan. So the first defense that it was inappropriate to bring out was dismissed, but their second defense was that they didn't have to consider it. There's no legal responsibility for to consider it. So whether or not it was appropriate or not aside, they had no legal requirement to consider non-native non-native exotic vegetation in their environmental impact statement related to deer management. And the judge agreed with the National Park Service on this. He said that the agencies historically have broad discretion, and that courts are required to defer to that discretion when developing environmental impact statements and NEPA analysis, and that in this case this was not arbitrary or capricious. It was just they wanted to develop a management plan for deer. That's what they did. They had no legal responsibility to take into account vegetation. So that complaint was dismissed. Basically, that just kind of tells you a couple of things going on. As a NEPA practitioner, preparer, you have to be careful about what you analyze, because then it can be used against you. Perhaps National Park Service, if they didn't feel that they were going to evaluate the use or evaluate non-native exotic vegetation in their EIS or in their management plan, maybe they shouldn't have considered it at all. It kind of seems out of left field for them to talk much about it. On the flip side, if they do, if it's a significant issue, they need to mention it, because maybe that's why the deer are attracted to this park or whatever. Then that needs to be properly analyzed, and then the lawyers defending this need to be aware that that was given that kind of due care. But at the end, the judges agreed with precedent that agencies do have this broad discretion. Just because they discussed it doesn't mean that they have to incorporate it in their management plan, as long as they didn't just weren't arbitrary and capricious. They didn't just dismiss it out of hand with no justification. So that's kind of the general take home for that one little portion of the lawsuit. It's an interesting lawsuit. I'll have it linked in the comments. You can take a look at it if you'd like. I'm sure some of you have already reviewed it for your discussions this week. I just had two kind of other minor things that I wanted to bring up. One thing that caught me, I read an article, and that's what kind of brought me to this lawsuit. I read an article about the plaintiffs and their legal filings, and one of the things that they made in their legal filings, they said that the executions of the deer, executions being their word, turned, and I quote, "a tranquil oasis of wilderness in the middle of our nation's capital into a killing field." I found that fairly that hyperbole to be disturbing, to be honest. It's a not only is it over the top, but in my mind, it's an obvious reference to the Cambodian genocide, killing fields, and the animal rights groups have a history of using this kind of hyperbole of genocide and slavery to connect it to our management of animals, things that we do. To food animals or those kind of things that we're not always proud of, and I think as a nation we have to take a look at that. But when you talk about using a management plan to keep deer from destroying a wildlife and from overpopulating to the fact, and this is the second point, overpopulating to the fact that they are lower body weight and damaging their own genetic capability, it's kind of saving them from themselves. When you compare that to a genocide in Southeast Asia resulting in millions of deaths, I just it leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Maybe I'm a little sensitive, but that's my impression there. And then that kind of refers to the last thing, and I'll leave a citation for this in the quotes, but Ohashiokura et al. States in a 2014 paper, they kind of talk about the effects of overpopulation with deer and how damaging it can be to both the deer and the environment, and the necessity for management plans. And so I think potentially when people get so squirmy when you talk about using lethal force to manage population, they kind of lose sight of the forest for the trees. They see the death of individual animals instead of the devastation on the environment and the animals that can cause with overpopulation. So a couple, I guess, last editorial comments. I look forward to hearing you guys' comments on this and reading your forum posts.